The sensors at the main colony began detecting the approaching superstorm 3 days before Jake had predicted it would arrive. The readings were so extreme that the technicians thought their equipment was malfunctioning. When backup systems confirmed the data, the colonial government called an emergency meeting to discuss evacuation options. Governor Patricia Martinez sat at the head of the council table studying reports. That seemed impossible to believe. This storm was larger than anything in their records. It stretched across 1,200 miles and contained an estimated 40 billion insects. The existing shelters could protect maybe half the population, and only if the storm passed quickly. A week-long siege would overwhelm their food and water supplies. Elena Rodriguez Walsh listened to the discussion with growing panic. As head of the colony's education department, she was responsible for the safety of 3,000 children. The schools had their own shelters, but they were designed for normal storms lasting a few hours. Elena found herself thinking about her stepson Jake for the first time in years. If the reports were accurate, this storm was similar to the one that had killed him 16 years ago. The colony's chief meteorologist, Dr. Lisa Chen, presented 3 possible courses of action. They could attempt a full evacuation to the mountain settlements, but moving 50,000 people would take weeks they did not have. They could implement strict rationing and hope the shelters held long enough for the storm to pass. Or they could pray for a miracle that would somehow turn the swarm away from their location. Jake and Joseph watched the colony's preparations from the hills overlooking the settlement. Jake could feel the massive swarm approaching like a weight pressing down on his consciousness. The swarm mother was excited by the prospect of such rich feeding. She showed Jake images of green growing things being stripped, bearing the satisfaction that would come from consuming everything in sight. Jake closed his eyes and reached out with his mind, trying to communicate with the alien intelligence. He offered the swarm mother alternative feeding grounds in the deep desert where no humans lived. But the response was clear and final. This storm was too large and too hungry to be satisfied with empty wasteland. It needed the rich plant life that humans had cultivated around their settlements. Joseph saw the pain on Jake's face and knew that normal methods would not work this time. He asked Jake if there was anything else that could be done. Jake explained that he might be able to fragment the swarm by inserting his consciousness into the collective mind and creating confusion about directions and destinations. Some parts of the swarm might break away and head toward different feeding areas, but Jake warned Joseph that the process would be extremely dangerous. He would have to surrender his individual identity and become part of the swarm mother's consciousness. There was no guarantee that he would be able to find his way back to being human. He might be lost forever in the alien intelligence that guided billions of hungry insects. Joseph felt his heart breaking as he realized what Jake was proposing. After 16 years of raising this boy as his son, he might lose him to save people who had never even known Jake existed. But Joseph also understood that this was why Jake had been given his extraordinary abilities. Sometimes a person's greatest gift was also their greatest sacrifice. Jake asked Joseph to take him to the colony's communication center. It was time for the Stormwalker to reveal himself and explain what he could do to help. Jake had decided that the colony needed to know the truth about their options, even if it meant exposing his own identity. Here. And Jake approached the colony gates during the afternoon shift change when guards were distracted by the controlled chaos of storm preparations. They slipped inside using paths that Joseph had mapped during his supply runs over the years. Jake was amazed to finally see the place his birth father had called home. The communication center was heavily guarded, but Jake's desert training allowed him to bypass the security systems. Within minutes, he had accessed the colony's emergency broadcast network. His message went out simultaneously to every screen and speaker in the settlement. Jake identified himself as the Stormwalker and explained that he had been protecting the outer settlements for months. He told the colonists that the approaching storm was beyond anything they had ever faced, but that he might be able to help if they were willing to trust him. Jake provided enough details about previous storms he had redirected to prove his identity to anyone who'd been paying attention to the reports. The response was immediate and chaotic. Governor Martinez demanded to know who Jake was and where he had come from. Dr. Chen wanted to understand how he could predict storms so accurately. Elena Rodriguez Walsh felt a strange chill when she heard the name Jake Martinez, but told herself it had to be a coincidence. Jake explained that he would answer all their questions later if he survived the attempt to break up the storm. Right now, they needed to evacuate as many people as possible to the deepest shelters and prepare for the worst-case scenario. He warned them that even if his plan worked, some parts of the swarm might still reach the colony. Joseph watched with pride as his adopted son took command of the situation with natural authority. Jake might have grown up hidden in the desert, but he had inherited his birth father's ability to lead people during a crisis. The colony officials found themselves following Jake's suggestions, even though they had no idea who he really was. Jake's final instruction was for everyone to stay in the shelters no matter what they heard happening above ground. He would be attempting something that had never been tried before, and the results might be frightening even if the plan succeeded. Jake assured them that he would protect them or die in the attempt. Elena Rodriguez Walsh felt tears running down her face as she listened to Jake's voice over the communication system. Something about his speech patterns reminded her powerfully of her first husband, Carlos. When Jake mentioned his full name, Elena finally understood what was happening. The baby she had left to die in the desert had somehow survived and grown into their potential savior. Jake and Joseph made their way to the highest point, overlooking the colony as the storm approached from the west. The sky was already turning black and the air filled with the sound of countless wings. Jake hugged his adopted father and thanked him for 16 years of love and protection. Joseph told Jake that he was proud of the man the boy had become. Jake walked out onto the exposed ridge and closed his eyes. He reached out with his consciousness toward the approaching storm and felt his mind being pulled into the vast alien intelligence that guided the swarms. Joseph watched as Jake's body went rigid and his eyes rolled back, showing only white. The boy he had raised was disappearing into something far larger and more powerful than any human mind. The great storm struck the ridge where Jake stood with the force of a hurricane. Joseph was forced to take shelter behind rocks as billions of locusts swept over the landscape. But instead of continuing toward the colony, the swarm began to behave strangely. Parts of it broke away and headed in different directions. Other sections seemed to be fighting among themselves. Joseph realized that Jake was succeeding in fragmenting the storm, but the cost was becoming clear. Jake's body remained standing on the ridge, but Joseph could see that his adopted son was no longer present in any meaningful sense. Jake had sacrificed his humanity to save 50,000 people he had never met. The battle for control of the swarm continued through the night. Joseph watched helplessly as Jake fought for the souls of two species in a conflict that would determine the future of human settlement on New Mesa. The battle inside the swarm's consciousness lasted 18 hours. Jake found himself fighting not just the swarm mother, but fragments of his own identity that threatened to dissolve completely into the alien intelligence. He held on to memories of Joseph's voice telling him stories in the canyon. He remembered the taste of water after days of thirst and the feeling of safety in his adopted father's arms. Slowly, Jake began to assert control over sections of the massive swarm. He convinced parts of the collective mind that better feeding grounds existed in uninhabited regions. He showed the insects images of lush valleys beyond the mountains where they could consume everything without harming humans. Most importantly, he demonstrated that humans and locusts could coexist if both species were willing to compromise. The great storm broke apart into 7 smaller swarms that scattered in different directions. 3 headed toward the empty eastern desert. 2 turned north toward the polar regions where they would eventually die from cold, but not before reproducing. 1 continued south toward the coastal marshes that could support a permanent population. The 7th and largest fragment remained near the colony but no longer showed aggressive intent. Governor Martinez and her council watched in amazement as their sensors tracked the fragmenting storm. What should have been a catastrophe that destroyed their civilization had become a manageable problem. Damage to the colony was minimal and no lives were lost. The mysterious Jake Martinez had somehow accomplished the impossible, but Jake paid a terrible price for his success. When Joseph finally reached him on the ridge, the young man was barely conscious and spoke in a mixture of human words and clicking sounds that resembled insect communication. Jake's eyes had changed from dark brown to a metallic gold that reflected light like compound lenses. His connection to the swarms had left permanent marks on both his body and mind. Joseph carried Jake back to their hidden camp and nursed him through 2 weeks of recovery. The young man suffered from nightmares where he experienced the world through thousands of different insect perspectives simultaneously. He would wake up trying to eat soil and dead leaves before remembering that humans needed different food. Most disturbing were the moments when Jake seemed to forget his own name and identity. But slowly, Jake's human consciousness reasserted itself. The bond with Joseph proved stronger than the alien influence trying to claim him. Jake began to remember who he was and why he had chosen to sacrifice so much to protect people he had never met. The golden color faded from his eyes, leaving them darker than before, but recognizably human. Jake's first clear words after the ordeal were a request to visit his birth father's grave. Joseph took him to the small cemetery outside the colony, where Carlos Martinez had been buried 17 years earlier. Jake knelt beside the weathered marker and spoke quietly to the father he had never known. He promised to use his gifts wisely and to honor the memory of a man who had loved children and wanted to make the world safer for them. Elena Rodriguez. Walsh was waiting for them when they returned to the cemetery gates. She had spent days working up the courage to face the young man she had tried to murder as an infant. Elena looked older than her years, and her hand shook as she approached Jake. She began to apologize, but Jake stopped her with a gesture. Jake told Elena that he forgave her for abandoning him in the desert. He explained that her cruelty had inadvertently put him exactly where he needed to be, to develop the abilities that saved the colony. If she had not left him to die, Joseph would never have found him. If Joseph had not raised him in the desert, he would never have learned to communicate with the swarms. Elena's evil act had become part of a larger pattern that ultimately served good. Elena broke down crying as she realized the magnitude of what Jake was offering her. This young man who had every right to hate her was instead giving her the gift of forgiveness.
She asked what she could do to make amends for her crime.
Jake suggested that she use her position in the education department to teach children about the importance of protecting the vulnerable and defenseless. The colonial government offered Jake a position as chief meteorologist and storm prediction specialist. Jake accepted the role but insisted on keeping his base camp in the desert, where he could maintain his connection to the swarms. He also requested that Joseph be appointed as his deputy and cultural advisor. The colony needed to understand that Jake's abilities came from traditions that were far older than their technology. Jake established the Stormwatch service that protected all human settlements on New Mesa. He trained a team of assistants in basic prediction techniques, though none of them could match his supernatural abilities. More importantly, Jake negotiated a treaty with the Swarm Mother that established feeding schedules and safe corridors that both species could respect. The remaining fragment of the great storm that had stayed near the colony became a permanent presence that Jake called the Guardian Swarm. These insects no longer showed any interest in consuming human crops or attacking settlements. Instead, they seemed to exist in a symbiotic relationship with Jake serving as an early warning system for other threats to the colony. Children grew up knowing that the golden clouds of locusts circling overhead were protectors rather than destroyers. Jake became a hero to the younger generation, who saw him as proof that humans could adapt to any environment if they were willing to learn and compromise. Schools taught classes about desert survival and storm prediction based on the techniques Jake shared with them. Jake's story spread throughout human space as news of his achievements reached other worlds. Scientists came to study his abilities while philosophers debated the implications of human-alien consciousness merging. Jake cooperated with researchers but insisted that his methods could not be easily replicated. Each world would need to find its own path toward coexistence with hostile environments. Joseph lived to see Jake marry a teacher named Mary Henderson and raise 3 children who inherited varying degrees of their father's storm prediction abilities. The oldest daughter could sense weather changes days in advance. The middle son showed an affinity for communicating with desert animals. The youngest boy seemed to have inherited normal human senses but possessed an intuitive understanding of survival skills that amazed his teachers. Jake took the name Crowfeather in honor of his adopted father, ensuring that Joseph's family line would continue through love rather than blood. The 2 men worked together for over 30 years, protecting the growing population of New Mesa. Joseph died peacefully at age 87, surrounded by the family
He had created through an act of
compassion in a desert canyon. At Joseph's funeral, Jake spoke about how one person's decision to choose mercy over selfishness had changed the fate of an entire world. He reminded the mourners that every individual action mattered in ways that might not become clear for years, or even decades. Joseph Crowfeather had saved one abandoned baby, and that baby had grown up to save everyone. The grave marker Joseph had requested was simple stone with words in both English and his ancestral language. It read, "He chose love over fear and changed everything." Jake visited the grave regularly and continued the tradition of telling stories about warriors who faced impossible odds and won through courage and wisdom. Jake lived to be 93 years old and remained active in storm prediction until his final year. His descendants continued the storm watch service, ensuring that New Mesa remained safe from locust attacks for generations. The techniques he developed were adapted for use on other frontier worlds where humans face similar environmental challenges. The legend of the Stormwalker became one of the most popular stories told throughout human space. It demonstrated that survival often required cooperation with alien forces rather than domination over them. Jake's example inspired countless other humans to look for ways to work with hostile environments, instead of simply trying to conquer them. Elena Rodriguez Walsh spent the remaining 40 years of her life working with disadvantaged children and became known as one of the colony's most dedicated advocates for child welfare. She never spoke publicly about her role in Jake's early life, but privately funded numerous programs to ensure that no child would ever face the kind of abandonment she had inflicted. Her later good works could not erase her original crime, but they provided some measure of redemption. The story ended as all good stories should, with the understanding that individual choices echo through time in ways that no one can predict. Jake Martinez had been abandoned to die in a locust storm, but survived to become the protector of his people. Joseph Crowfeather had risked everything to save a stranger's child and created a legacy that outlasted his own lifetime. Together, they proved that humanity's greatest strength was not its technology or weapons, but its capacity for compassion, even in the darkest circumstances. Jake was 16 when he discovered the truth about his abandonment in a way that Joseph had never planned. The boy had grown tall and strong with his father's dark eyes and his adopted father's quiet confidence. He moved through the desert like he was born to it, but Joseph could see the questions growing behind his eyes. Questions about why they lived alone and why he never met other people his age. Joseph had been planning to tell Jake everything on his 18th birthday. He had rehearsed the conversation many times in his head, trying to find words that would help the boy understand, without filling him with hatred. But fate decided the timing for him during what should have been a routine supply run to the settlement. Jake had begged to come along on the trip. He was tired of staying hidden in the camp and wanted to see the place his birth father had lived and worked. Joseph finally agreed, but made Jake promise to stay in the hills outside town while Joseph went in alone. The boy seemed to accept this arrangement, but Joseph should have known better. Jake had never been good at following rules that did not make sense to him. While Joseph was trading for supplies in the main marketplace, Jake slipped into the settlement from the east side. The boy moved like a ghost through the back alleys using skills Joseph had taught him for desert stalking. No one saw him as he explored the streets where his father had walked. Jake found the small house where Carlos Martinez had lived with his family. It was now occupied by strangers, but an elderly neighbor remembered the young miner who had died in the accident. The old woman told Jake stories about Carlos and mentioned how excited he had been about his new baby son. She also talked about the tragedy of the child being killed by wild animals during the Great Storm. Something about the woman's story bothered Jake. He asked careful questions about the timeline and learned that the baby had supposedly died the same day as the storm that Joseph had told him about. The storm where Joseph had found him as an abandoned infant. The details were too close to be coincidence. Jake made his way to the colony's administrative building where public records were kept. His desert training served him well as he slipped inside without being detected. The computer terminals were more advanced than anything he had used, but Jake was naturally gifted with technology. Within an hour, he had accessed the files related to his father's death and the reported loss of the infant. What Jake found made his blood turn cold. Elena Rodriguez's statement about her stepson being taken by animals was filed only hours after the storm ended. But the details did not match what Joseph had told him about being found abandoned before the storm hit. Jake realized that Elena had lied to the authorities about when and how the baby disappeared. Jake dug deeper into the records and found Elena's personal logs that had been submitted as evidence during the inquiry into the baby's death. In her own words, Elena described her feelings of resentment toward the child and her desire to start fresh. She wrote about how the storm presented an opportunity to solve her problems. The logs stopped just short of admitting outright murder, but the meaning was clear to anyone who read them carefully. Jake sat in the dark records room, feeling like the world had shifted around him. Everything Joseph had told him was true, but there was more to the story than his adopted father had revealed. Elena had not just abandoned him carelessly. She had deliberately planned his death and then lied about it to avoid punishment. Jake left the building as silently as he had entered and made his way back toward the hills where Joseph was waiting. But instead of returning immediately to their meeting spot, Jake detoured through the residential district. He wanted to see the woman who had tried to murder him. Elena Rodriguez Walsh lived in one of the nicest houses in the settlement. Jake watched from the shadows as she worked in her garden, while her 2 young children played nearby. She looked older than he had expected, but comfortable and confident. This was a woman who had gotten everything she wanted and felt no guilt about how she had achieved it. Jake felt rage building in his chest like a fire that threatened to consume him from inside. This woman had left him to die in the desert and then built a happy life on the lie of his death. She had children now that she loved and protected while his own father's son had grown up hidden in caves and canyons. The injustice of it made Jake want to scream. When Joseph found Jake an hour later, the boy was sitting on a cliff overlooking the settlement with his hands clenched into fists. Joseph took one look at Jake's face and knew that something had gone terribly wrong. He sat down beside the boy and waited for him to speak. Jake told Joseph everything he had discovered in a voice tight with controlled fury. He described reading Elena's logs and seeing her with her new family. He talked about the years he had spent hiding while she lived openly and happily. By the time he finished talking, Jake's whole body was shaking with anger. Joseph listened without interrupting until Jake was done, then sat quietly for several minutes before responding. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. He told Jake that he had hoped to spare him this knowledge until he was older and better equipped to handle it. But now that Jake knew the truth, they needed to talk about what it meant and what he planned to do with it. Jake said he wanted revenge. He wanted Elena to pay for what she had done. He had spent 16 years learning desert survival, and he knew ways to make people disappear without a trace. Joseph nodded as if he understood, but then began to tell Jake a different kind of story. Joseph talked about his own father, who had been killed by men who feared Native Americans on the frontier worlds. He described the years he had spent planning revenge against those men, and how that anger had nearly destroyed his life. He explained how his grandmother had finally taught him that carrying hatred was like drinking poison, and expecting your enemies to die from it. Joseph told Jake that Elena Rodriguez Walsh was already paying for her crimes in ways she did not even understand. She was living a life built on lies and murder. She had to look at her children every day knowing she had killed another woman's child. She would never know real peace or happiness because deep down she knew what kind of person she really was. Jake listened, but Joseph could see the boy was not convinced. The rage was still burning in his eyes, and Joseph knew that words alone would not be enough to cool it. Jake needed time to process what he had learned, and to decide what kind of man he wanted to become. Joseph just hoped he had raised the boy with enough wisdom to make the right choice when the time came. They rode back to their hidden camp in silence as the sun set over the desert. Jake stared at the horizon where the settlement's lights were beginning to flicker on. Somewhere in those lights was a woman who had tried to kill him and failed. Jake had the power to return that favor if he chose. The question was whether he would let revenge define his life or find a different path forward. Joseph watched his adopted son and prayed to whatever spirits still listened that Jake would choose wisely. The boy had gifts that could help many people, but only if he could move past the hatred that threatened to poison his heart. Jake spent 3 weeks wrestling with his anger before he finally made peace with what he had learned about Elena. The turning point came during a meditation practice that Joseph had taught him years earlier. As Jake sat quietly watching the sunrise, he realized that his rage was hurting him more than it was hurting Elena. She was living her life completely unaware of his existence while he was consumed by thoughts of revenge. Joseph watched the change in his adopted son with relief and pride. Jake's natural compassion was stronger than his desire for vengeance. The boy had chosen to focus on building rather than destroying. But Joseph also noticed that Jake's supernatural abilities were growing stronger as he matured emotionally. The connection to the locust swarms was becoming more powerful and more complex. Jake could now predict storm patterns weeks in advance with perfect accuracy. He knew exactly how many insects were in each swarm and which direction they would travel. Most remarkably, he seemed to be developing the ability to communicate with the collective intelligence that guided the locusts. Joseph often found Jake standing motionless with his eyes closed, seeming to listen to something only he could hear. One evening, Jake told Joseph that he had been having conversations with what he called the Swarm Mother. This was apparently the central intelligence that controlled all the locust populations on New Mesa. Jake described it as ancient and hungry, but not evil. The locusts were simply following their nature just like any other living creatures. They consumed everything in their path because that was what they were designed to do. Joseph was fascinated and slightly worried by these revelations. Jake's abilities were beyond anything he had heard of before. The boy was becoming something more than human, but Joseph was not sure what that meant for his future. Jake seemed to understand Joseph's concerns and assured him that he still felt human in all the ways that mattered. The connection to the swarms was just another sense like sight or hearing. Jake proved his control over his abilities when a small storm threatened a mining camp 50 miles from the main settlement. Joseph had been hired to guide a supply convoy to the camp, and Jake had come along to help with navigation. When Jake sensed the approaching swarm, he asked Joseph to trust him and let him try something new. Jake walked out into the desert and stood directly in the path of the oncoming locusts. Joseph watched in terror as billions of insects swept down from the sky toward his adopted son. But instead of devouring Jake, the swarm parted around him like water flowing around a stone. Jake stood calmly in the center of a tornado of hungry insects that could have stripped him to bone in seconds. The locusts circled Jake for several minutes, then suddenly changed direction and flew away toward the mountains. The mining camp was saved without a single building being damaged. Jake walked back to Joseph looking tired but satisfied. He explained that he had convinced the swarm mother to find food elsewhere by showing her images of empty desert where the insects could feed without harming humans. Word of the miracle at the mining camp spread quickly through the underground networks that connected the scattered settlements on New Mesa. People began talking about a mysterious figure they called the Stormwalker who appeared before major swarms to warn isolated communities. No one knew who this person was, but everyone was grateful for the protection. Joseph realized that Jake had found his calling. The boy's unique gifts were meant to be used in service of others. But Joseph also knew that Jake could not continue working anonymously forever. Eventually, someone would want to know who the Stormwalker really was and where his abilities came from. When that happened, Jake would need to be ready with answers. Joseph began teaching Jake about politics and human nature. The boy was brilliant with technical subjects but naive about how people behaved when they were afraid or greedy. Joseph explained that Jake's abilities would make some people see him as a savior, while others would view him as a threat. Jake would need to navigate both reactions carefully if he wanted to help people without being destroyed in the process. Jake's reputation as the Stormwalker continued to grow over the following months. He saved 3 more settlements from surprise attacks and helped redirect several major swarms away from populated areas. The colonial government began offering rewards for information about the mysterious protector, but no one could provide useful details. Jake was too skilled at moving unseen and too careful about covering his tracks. But Jake's growing connection to the swarms was taking a toll on him. He began experiencing dreams where he saw the world through compound eyes and felt the endless hunger that drove the insects forward. Sometimes he would wake up with his mouth full of sand as if he had been trying to eat dirt and dead plants. Joseph watched these changes with growing concern. Jake assured Joseph that he was still in control of his own mind, but Joseph could see the boy struggling with impulses that were not entirely human. The connection that gave Jake his power also carried risks that neither of them fully understood. Joseph began to wonder if Jake would eventually be consumed by the alien intelligence he was communing with. The crisis came when Jake predicted the largest storm in New Mesa's recorded history. The swarm was so massive that it would cover half the continent and last for over a week. Every human settlement would be at risk, including the main colony, with its 50,000 residents. Jake realized that his usual methods of redirecting the swarm would not work. This storm was too big and too hungry to be turned. Aside with gentle persuasion, Jake told Joseph that he might be able to split the swarm and send parts of it in different directions, but doing so would require him to merge more completely with the swarm mother than ever before. He would have to surrender his individual consciousness temporarily and trust that he could find his way back to himself afterward. Joseph was terrified by the plan but could see no alternative that would save so many lives. Jake began preparing for what might be his final act as a human being. He wrote letters to be delivered to various people, including one for Elena Rodriguez Walsh. In that letter, he forgave her for abandoning him and thanked her for inadvertently putting him in a position to help others. Jake told Joseph that holding on to anger had been like carrying a heavy stone that served no purpose. It was time to put the stone down and use his energy for better things. Joseph watched his adopted son make these preparations with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Jake had grown into exactly the kind of man that Carlos Martinez would have wanted his son to become, but Joseph was not sure he would ever see that man again after Jake merged with the alien consciousness that controlled the swarms. The great storm was now only days away. Jake could feel it approaching like a vast shadow moving across his mind. Soon he would have to make the choice that would define not just his own fate but the future of every human on New Mesa. Joseph could only watch and pray that the boy he had raised would find the strength to save both himself and everyone else. Joseph built a hidden camp in the deep desert 20 miles from the main settlement. He chose a place where 3 canyons met, creating natural walls on 3 sides and easy escape routes if needed. Water seeped from rocks in several spots, and there were caves that stayed cool during the brutal midday heat. It was the perfect place to raise a child who needed to stay invisible. Jake grew strong in the hidden camp. By his first birthday, he was walking steadily across the uneven ground. By 2, he could recognize the warning signs that meant a storm was coming hours before it appeared on the horizon. Joseph taught him to read the desert like a book written in sand and stone and sky. The boy learned to move silently through the canyons, and to hide so well that Joseph sometimes had trouble finding him even when he knew where to look. Jake could identify edible plants and dangerous ones by smell alone. He knew which rocks held water and which caves offered the best shelter. Most importantly, he learned that the desert was not an enemy, but a teacher that would share its secrets with those wise enough to listen. Joseph made regular trips to the settlement for supplies and information. He told people he was doing extended scouting work for the mining companies. No one questioned his absences because Joseph had always been a loner who preferred the desert to town life. He was careful to buy only what a single man would need and to never show interest in children's items. During these trips, Joseph gathered information about Jake's biological family. He learned that Elena Rodriguez had remarried a man named Peter Walsh only 6 months after the storm. She now had 2 children with her new husband and seemed to have completely forgotten about her first stepson. Joseph watched her sometimes from a distance and saw no signs of guilt or regret. She acted like a woman who had solved all her problems. Joseph also learned more about Jake's real father, Carlos Martinez. The man had been well liked in the settlement and known for his kindness to children and animals. Several people mentioned how excited Carlos had been about his baby son, and how he had planned to teach the boy everything about desert survival. Joseph wished he could have known Carlos but felt honored to carry on the man's dreams for his son. Jake's abilities continued to develop in ways that amazed Joseph. The boy could predict weather changes with accuracy that surpassed the settlement's computer systems. He seemed to know when animals were nearby even when they were completely hidden. Most remarkably, he could sense locust swarms when they were still hundreds of miles away. When Jake was 4 years old, he woke Joseph one night by tugging on his shirt and pointing toward the eastern sky. Joseph saw nothing unusual, but Jake kept insisting that danger was coming. Joseph had learned to trust the boy's instincts, so he began preparing their emergency shelter. 6 hours later, the settlement's warning sirens began wailing as sensors detected an approaching swarm. The storm that followed was moderate by New Mesa standards, but it would have caught the settlement completely off guard without the early warning systems. Joseph realized that Jake's connection to the locust swarms went deeper than normal human senses. The boy was somehow linked to the collective mind of the insects in ways that Joseph did not fully understand. As Jake grew older, Joseph began to struggle with questions about the boy's future. The hidden camp was perfect for a small child, but Jake needed more than just survival skills. He needed education and social contact with other people. He needed to understand the larger world beyond the desert. Most of all, he needed to know the truth about his past. Joseph decided to begin teaching Jake about his real heritage. He told the boy stories about his birth father, Carlos, and how much the man had loved him. He explained about the stepmother who had abandoned him and the storm that had nearly killed them both. Jake listened to these stories with serious attention but showed no anger or sadness. He seemed to accept his past as simply another fact about the world. When Jake turned 10, Joseph began taking him on longer trips into unexplored parts of the desert. The boy's abilities were now so advanced that he could navigate by instinct alone, even in areas where no human had ever traveled. Jake could find water in places that looked completely barren. He could predict exactly when and where storms would strike. Most impressively, he could communicate with the locust swarms in ways that kept them from attacking. Joseph watched in amazement as Jake would stand in the path of a small swarm and somehow convince the insects to change direction. The boy never explained how he did this, and Joseph never asked. Some gifts were too sacred to discuss in ordinary words. But Jake's growing powers came with a price. The boy began having dreams about flying and hunger and the taste of green-growing things. He would wake up talking about places he had never been and people he had never met. Joseph realized that Jake's connection to the swarms was becoming stronger and more complex as he matured. Joseph also noticed that Jake was becoming lonely despite their close relationship. The boy would ask questions about other children and what it would be like to have friends his own age. Joseph knew that keeping Jake isolated forever would damage him in ways that might never heal. But he also knew that revealing Jake's existence would put the boy in terrible danger. The settlement had grown larger over the years, and now included families from several different worlds. There were teachers and doctors and even some artists who had come to document life on the frontier. Joseph began to think that Jake might be able to blend in with the other children if they were careful about his story, but first Joseph needed to deal with Elena Rodriguez Walsh. The woman was now one of the most prominent citizens in the settlement. Her husband Peter had been elected to the colony council, and Elena ran several community organizations. She had completely reinvented herself as a pillar of society and seemed to have buried all memories of the baby she had left to die. Joseph spent months watching Elena and her family. He saw her with her two younger children and noticed how differently she treated them compared to how the older residents remembered. Her behavior toward Jake, she was attentive and protective with her own offspring in ways she had never been with her stepson. Joseph began to formulate a plan that would allow Jake to enter the settlement safely while ensuring that Elena could never hurt him again. It would require careful timing and perfect execution, but Joseph believed it could work. Jake deserved the chance to live a normal life among other people. He deserved to use his gifts to help the community that his birth father had loved. The time had come for Jake Crowfeather to step out of the shadows and claim his rightful place in the world. Joseph only hoped he had taught the boy enough wisdom and strength to survive what was coming next. The storm raged for 3 full days. Joseph had experienced locust swarms before, but never one this intense or long-lasting. The canyon that had seemed like perfect shelter on the first day began to feel like a tomb as time stretched on. The baby needed food, and Joseph's water supply was running dangerously low. On the second day, Joseph rationed the water carefully. He gave the infant small drops every few hours and took only tiny sips himself. The baby was getting weaker but still alert. His dark eyes followed Joseph's movements, and he seemed to listen when Joseph spoke to him in quiet tones. Joseph found himself talking to the child more and more as the hours passed. He told stories about his great-grandfather, who had hidden from cavalry soldiers in caves much like this one. About his aunt who could track animals across solid rock by reading signs that others could not see. About the old ways of surviving when the whole world seemed set against you. The baby made small sounds in response as if he was trying to answer. Joseph began to think of these as conversations. When he asked the child questions, the infant would move his arms or make different noises as if giving his opinion. Joseph knew it was probably just coincidence, but it helped pass the terrible hours of waiting. On the third day, the water ran out completely. Joseph was starting to feel dizzy from dehydration, and the baby had stopped making sounds altogether. Joseph held the tiny body against his chest and felt how light the child had become. He began to wonder if his decision to shelter in the canyon had been wrong. Maybe they should have tried to reach the settlement after all. But just as Joseph was beginning to lose hope, the sound above them started to change. The constant roar that had filled their world for 3 days was breaking up into separate sounds. Individual groups of locusts rather than one massive swarm. Joseph waited another hour to be sure, then carefully made his way to the canyon entrance. The world outside looked like the surface of a dead planet. Every plant had been stripped bare. The ground was covered with a thick layer of dead locusts that had fallen from exhaustion or been killed by others in the feeding frenzy. The smell was overwhelming, but Joseph had never been so happy to see sunlight. He gathered some of the dead locusts and brought them back to the fire. These insects were actually edible if cooked properly. His grandmother had shown him how to prepare them during his childhood on old Earth. Joseph roasted several over the fire and chewed them thoroughly to extract moisture. It was not much, but better than nothing. The baby was very weak now, and Joseph was not sure the child would survive much longer without proper food and water. But as Joseph held the infant and sang softly, he noticed something remarkable happening. The baby's breathing was becoming steadier. His skin felt less hot. Somehow the child was drawing strength from Joseph's presence and voice. Joseph spent the rest of the day telling the baby every story he could remember. Stories about warriors who never gave up. About mothers who carried their children across impossible distances to reach safety. About the spirit that lived inside all living things and gave them the will to keep fighting even when death seemed certain. As night fell, Joseph made another discovery. When he stopped talking, the baby would become restless and his breathing would get shallow. But when Joseph resumed the stories, the child would calm down and seem to grow stronger. It was as if the words themselves were somehow nourishing the infant. Joseph realized something profound was happening between them. This was not just an adult caring for a helpless child. They were bonding in a way that went deeper than ordinary relationships. The baby had been abandoned by his blood family but was choosing Joseph as his real father. And Joseph was accepting that role with his whole heart. On the 4th morning, the canyon was finally quiet. Joseph waited until noon to be absolutely certain the storm had passed, then prepared to leave their shelter. He wrapped the baby carefully in his coat and gathered what remained of his supplies. The child looked up at him with complete trust, as if he knew that Joseph would never abandon him. The walk back toward the settlement was difficult. Joseph was weak from dehydration and lack of food. The desert looked completely different after the storm. Landmarks had been buried or stripped away. Navigation was challenging even for someone with Joseph's skills. But something was guiding him now. Maybe it was instinct or maybe something more spiritual. But Joseph found himself taking paths that felt right even when he could not see where they led. The baby seemed to sense the direction too. When Joseph paused at crossroads, the infant would turn his head toward one path or another as if pointing the way. They reached a water seep that Joseph had forgotten existed. It was just a trickle coming out of rocks, but it was clean and sweet. Joseph drank carefully and gave the baby drops of water on his finger. The child sucked eagerly, and for the first time in days his eyes seemed bright and aware. Joseph made camp beside the water and spent another night with the baby. He built a small fire and continued the stories that seemed to give them both strength. He told the child about his new name, Jake Crowfeather. The first name had been written on the blanket when Joseph found him. The second was Joseph's family name that he was passing on to this adopted son. The baby responded to his new name by reaching up toward Joseph's face with his tiny hands. Joseph let the infant touch his weathered cheek and felt something pass between them that was stronger than blood or law. This child belonged to him now, and he belonged to the child. They were family in the deepest sense of the word. Joseph also made another decision that night. He would not return Jake to the settlement right away. Whoever had abandoned this baby was still there and might try to harm him again. Joseph needed time to make plans and prepare a safe place for his new son to grow up. The next morning, Joseph cached most of his remaining supplies near the water source and set out for the settlement, carrying only what he needed for a quick scouting trip. He left Jake sleeping peacefully in a shelter he built from rocks and dead branches. The baby seemed to understand that Joseph would return. He did not cry when Joseph walked away. Joseph reached the outskirts of the settlement by midday. He could see people working to clear storm damage and repair buildings. Life was returning to normal after another brush with death. Joseph watched from a distance and made careful notes about who was there and how they were acting. He was looking for signs of guilt or relief from someone who thought a certain baby had died in the storm. Joseph had learned to read people almost as well as he could read animal tracks. Somewhere in that settlement was the person who had tried to murder an innocent child. Joseph planned to find that person and make sure they never had the chance to hurt Jake again. But first he had to return to his son who was waiting by the water seep. Jake Crowfeather had survived the storm and the abandonment. Now it was time for him to learn what it really meant to be part of a family that would never let him down. Joseph Crowfeather felt the storm coming in his bones long before the colony's warning systems detected it. His grandmother had taught him to read the signs that most people missed. The way certain birds stopped singing. How the wind changed direction twice in an hour. The taste of metal that crept into the back of your throat. He was 2 miles east of the main settlement checking trap lines when he heard the crying. At first he thought it might be some small desert animal caught in one of his snares. But as he got closer, the sound became unmistakably human. A baby was crying somewhere nearby. Joseph climbed the small rise where the sound seemed strongest. What he found made him stop cold. A tiny infant lay on a blanket in the red sand. The baby wore clean clothes and there was a water bottle beside him, but no adult in sight. Joseph looked around for tracks and found only one set leading back toward the settlement. Someone had walked out here alone and left this child to die. The baby stopped crying when he saw Joseph and looked up at him with dark, serious eyes. Joseph knelt down and picked up the infant carefully. The child was maybe 3 or 4 months old and clearly well cared for until recently. This was no accident. Someone had brought this baby out here on purpose, knowing what was coming. Joseph felt anger rise in his chest like fire. He had seen cruelty before in his 43 years, but leaving a helpless infant to be torn apart by locusts was evil beyond understanding. He looked toward the settlement and could see people still running toward the shelters. Whoever had done this was probably among them right now, pretending to be innocent. The baby started crying again, and Joseph realized he had to make a choice quickly. The storm would be here in less than an hour. He could try to run back to the settlement, but the shelters would be sealed by the time he arrived. Even if he made it, the baby might not survive the trip in this heat. Or he could find shelter out here and try to wait out the storm. Joseph knew the desert better than anyone in the colony. He had been born on Old Earth, but his family were among the first wave of colonists to New Mesa 15 years ago. His parents had died in an accident when he was 30, but not before teaching him every survival skill their ancestors had passed down through generations. He knew places in the desert where a person could hide if they were smart and careful and very lucky. The sound of the approaching swarm was getting louder now. Joseph could see the black wall on the horizon growing taller as it came closer. He wrapped the baby in his leather coat and started walking toward a canyon he remembered from his early scouting days. It was narrow and deep with overhangs that might provide some protection. As he walked, Joseph found himself talking to the infant in his arms. He told the baby about his grandmother who could predict weather by watching how ants moved. About his grandfather who had survived 3 winters trapped in a cave with nothing but his knife and his wits. About warriors who faced impossible odds and won through courage and wisdom. The baby seemed to calm down when Joseph spoke. Maybe it was the rhythm of his voice, or maybe the child somehow understood that this man would not abandon him. Joseph quickened his pace as the wind began to pick up. Sand stung his face and the air grew thick with the smell of the approaching swarm. The canyon was exactly where Joseph remembered it. The entrance was narrow enough that a person had to squeeze through sideways, but inside it opened up into a space about 10 feet wide and 30 feet long. Most importantly, the walls curved inward at the top, creating natural overhangs that would block most of the locusts from getting inside. Joseph quickly gathered dead wood and dry grass from the canyon floor. He built a small fire near the back wall where the smoke would be trapped under the overhang. The smoke would help keep insects away, and the fire would provide light during the hours of darkness ahead. He also found several large flat stones that he could use to cover the canyon entrance if needed. The baby was getting fussy again, so Joseph gave him a few drops of water from his bottle. The infant sucked greedily at his finger when Joseph dipped it in the water. Joseph realized the child was probably hungry too, but there was nothing he could do about that. They would both have to survive on water and hope for the best. The storm hit the canyon like the end of the world. One moment Joseph could see blue sky above, and the next everything went black. The sound was beyond description. Billions of insects flying at tremendous speed created a noise that seemed to shake the very stones of the canyon walls. Joseph pulled the baby close to his chest and covered them both with his coat. The Locust found the canyon entrance within minutes. They poured through the narrow opening like a river of death, but most of them crashed into the walls or each other in the confined space. Joseph had positioned himself far enough back that only a few reached them, and these were confused and disoriented by the smoke from his fire. Joseph used his knife to kill the locusts that got too close. Each one was the size of his hand, with jaws that could bite through leather. Their wings made a metallic ringing sound when they hit the stone walls. But the smoke and the narrow space worked in their favor. Most of the swarm passed over the canyon without finding the entrance. Hours passed in the deafening darkness. Joseph held the baby against his chest and felt the tiny heartbeat through the leather coat. The child had stopped crying completely now, as if he understood that silence meant survival. Joseph found himself humming old songs his grandmother had taught him. Songs about endurance and hope and the strength that comes from having nothing left to lose. The baby began to respond to the humming. When Joseph paused, the infant would make small sounds as if trying to join in. Joseph smiled in the darkness and continued singing. He told the child stories about his ancestors who had crossed impossible distances on foot. About winter so cold that people had to share body heat to survive. About the sacred bond between those who protect and those who need protection. Sometime near dawn, the sound above them began to change. The roar of the main swarm was moving past them now, heading east toward the mountains. Joseph kept very still and continued to hold the baby close. Stragglers from the swarm would continue to pass overhead for several more hours, but the worst was over. Joseph looked down at the sleeping infant in his arms. This child had survived something that should have killed him twice over. First the abandonment in the desert heat, and now a locust storm that few adults could endure. There was something special about this baby. Something strong and determined that refused to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter down into the canyon, Joseph made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The red dust swirled across the desert floor as Elena Rodriguez clutched the crying baby against her chest. The tiny boy was only 3 months old, but his wails cut through the hot air like a knife. She hated that sound. She hated everything about this place called New Mesa, and she hated the child that tied her to memories of her dead husband. The alarm bells rang across the colony settlement. Everyone knew what that meant. A locust storm was coming. These were not the small insects from old Earth that her grandmother used to tell stories about. These creatures were the size of a human hand, with metal-hard shells and teeth that could chew through bone. When they came in swarms of billions, the sky would turn black, and anything caught in the open would be stripped to nothing in minutes. Elena looked down at baby Jake Martinez. His father, Carlos, had died 6 months ago in a mining accident deep below the surface. The company had paid her some money, but not enough to leave this world. She was stuck here with a baby that was not even her own blood. Carlos had been married before, and Jake was the son of his first wife, who died giving birth. Elena had only married Carlos for security, and now he was gone. The evacuation sirens grew louder. All around her, people were running toward the underground shelters built deep into the rock. The colony had learned the hard way that these shelters were the only safe place when the storms came. Elena walked slowly away from the crowd. She had made her decision 3 days ago when she heard this storm was going to be bigger than any they had seen before. The baby continued to cry as Elena carried him toward the edge of the settlement. Behind her, she could hear people shouting for everyone to hurry. The storm would be here soon. The sky to the west was already changing color from blue to a sick yellow. That meant the swarm was maybe an hour away. Elena found the spot she had picked out earlier. It was a small rise in the desert about 2 miles from the main settlement. Far enough that no rescue team would search here, but close enough that she could make it back to safety before the storm hit. She set the baby down on the red sand and stepped back. Jake looked up at her with his dark eyes. He had stopped crying for a moment, as if he knew something was wrong. Elena felt a small twist in her stomach, but pushed the feeling away. This was her chance for freedom. Without the baby, she could request transfer to another world. She could start over somewhere green and safe where storms did not try to kill everyone. She turned and walked away. Behind her, the baby started crying again, but Elena did not look back. She had left some water and a blanket, but she knew it would not matter. The storm would take care of everything, and when the rescue team searched later, they would find nothing. She would tell them wild animals took the child during the confusion of evacuation. No one would question her story. The walk back to the settlement took 30 minutes. Elena could feel the wind getting stronger and the air getting thicker. In the distance, she could see the black wall of the approaching swarm. It stretched across the entire horizon like a moving mountain. The sound was starting now, too. A deep humming buzz that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Elena reached the shelter entrance just as the last stragglers were going inside. The heavy metal doors would seal shut in minutes. She slipped inside and found a spot among the other families. Someone asked her where Jake was, and she put on her best worried face. She told them the baby had been taken by wild dogs during the evacuation. Several people offered to help search, but Elena said it was too late. The storm was too close now. The shelter doors slammed shut with a sound like thunder. The thick metal walls would keep them safe, but everyone knew the next few hours would be terrible. The locusts would cover every inch of the surface above them. The sound would be so loud that people would stuff cloth in their ears and still hear the buzzing in their bones. Elena found a corner and sat down. Around her, families huddled together. Children cried and parents whispered soft words to calm them. Some people prayed to whatever gods they still believed in. Elena closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself somewhere else. Maybe a world with oceans and trees where the biggest worry was what to have for dinner. Above them, the storm hit the settlement like a hammer. Even through the thick walls, they could hear the roar of billions of insects striking metal and stone. The shelter shook as if the planet itself was trying to throw them off. Emergency lights flickered and someone started screaming before others hushed them quiet. Elena thought about the baby out there in the desert. By now, the storm would have reached him. She tried not to picture what was happening, but her mind kept showing her images anyway. She pushed them away and focused on her plans. In a few days, when the storm passed, she would file the paperwork to leave New Mesa. She would go somewhere civilized where people lived normal lives. The storm raged for hours. Elena dozed fitfully against the cold wall of the shelter. In her dreams, she saw dark skies and heard crying that might have been the wind or might have been something else. When she woke, the shelter was quieter. The sound from above had changed from a roar to a steady rumble. An old man near her was telling his grandson stories about the first colonists who came to New Mesa, how they had not known about the storms and lost half their people in the first year, how they learned to read the signs and build shelters and warning systems. The man's voice was soft and steady, like he was trying to hypnotize the fear away. Elena listened with half her mind, while the other half planned her new life. She would go to one of the inner worlds where they had real cities and real jobs. Maybe she would find another man to marry. Someone who already had his life figured out and did not need her to take care of babies or live in holes in the ground when monsters came calling. The storm above them continued through the night. Elena slept and woke and slept again. Each time she woke, she felt a little more free. By morning, it would all be over and her new life could begin.